tribal leaders, native scholars, and historians say the U.S. government has a long history of breaking treaty and trust responsibilities to tribes, including here in the Southwest. Tribal leaders and native rights advocates are closely watching actions by the Trump administration to ensure they're not left out in policies or government changes. Correspondent Antonia Gonzalez takes a look at the unique relationship American Indian tribes have with the federal government, starting with an overview of tribal treaty rights.
Joining me now is Nick Estes, an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico, and the native scholar is from the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Antonia.
So let's start with the basics. Tell us, what are treaties between tribes and the United States?
So the practice of treaty making goes back to the very founding of the United States and actually goes back prior to the existence of the United States. So for example, the Lakota people, or the Oceti-Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, had entered into formal relations with other nations of people prior to the arrival of the United States. Our first compact that we have recorded was with Te-Skawi, the White Buffalo Calf Woman, who essentially brought us into formal relations with the non-human world, such as the Buffalo Nation and the plants and the water and the land. So treaty making was very much part of our tradition, but we didn't make treaties with just human nations. We made treaties with non-human nations as well. And so when the United States first came, in 1803, with the arrival of Lewis and Clark, the United States was less than a quarter century old, and it needed to establish essentially military alliances with certain indigenous peoples. And so we entered our first treaty, I think it was in 1814 or 1815, and then subsequently we entered into 35 treaties with the United States. So the United States has confirmed 35 times the nationhood status of the Oceti-Sakowin, just the Oceti-Sakowin, just the Great Sioux Nation, but has confirmed in the U.S.'s own existence over the last 250 years, 370 times the independent nationhood status of indigenous nations. So the U.S. has ratified over 370 treaties with indigenous nations, not as inferior, but as equals to the U.S. If we interpret, because treaties, the thing with treaties is that treaties are interpreted by both parties, not just one party. And so the U.S. has had a dominance on the interpretation of these treaties. But if you ask indigenous nations, they would say we entered into these relations as equals, as partners. So that's the kind of brief synopsis of the history of treaty making in the United States.
And explain a little bit about why treaties are relevant today.
Treaties are relevant today not because indigenous people say so, and not because indigenous scholars such as myself say so, but because Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says so, which says treaties are the supreme law of the land. And there's a lot of debate around the relevance of certain amendments to the Constitution, such as the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But I think it's worth going back and looking at the Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which says, treaties are the supreme law of the land. Sovereigns don't enter into relations with domestic dependent populations, right? Unfortunately, as federal court cases have shown over the years, is that's how the U.S. has interpreted treaties, but not indigenous nations. So indigenous nations today exist within the United States, federally recognized indigenous nations, because of formal relations with the U.S. Through that treaty making process or through some other form of agreement. For example, there were over 500 different agreements made with the United States, including the ratified treaties, and there were unratified treaties as well as other agreements. And so those count as a recognition of nationhood as well. So today, me as a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, I trace that citizenship back to that 1868 treaty, but then also we had a separate treaty as the Lower Brule people in 1865, which was called the 1865 Fort Sully Treaty.
And treaty rights are often challenged, especially in court. Recent cases involving hunting and fishing. There's a case that will go before the Supreme Court on hunting. And recently, the High Court tie, basically, tribes called it a win for salmon in the Colvert case in Washington State and for treaty fishing rights. Tell us a little bit about the High Court and any kind of legal challenges when it comes to tribal treaty rights.
Sure, and just to talk a little bit about the case that was just recently decided on, it was a split in the Supreme Court. So they went back to the lower court they upheld the lower court's decision. So it was a victory in many senses of the word, and that should be celebrated. And also something to note is that it was a victory for the salmon. So going back to how we interpreted treaties, we weren't just signing treaties with the United States. We were also upholding our original commitments to our relationships to non-human beings, such as salmon, such as the Buffalo Nation, for example, for us, the Teoyate. And so when we say in the treaty, it says, so long as the buffalo shall roam, to justify the chase for the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. What that means is that our treaty territory was defined by the existence of buffalo herds. And so when the US government began exterminating buffalo herds, that translated into the taking of that land as well. And so it's not just, again, when we say we're water protectors or when we say we're land defenders, we're also taking care of those non-human relationships that we had established. And so when we look at treaty cases that go into the Supreme Court, they really shouldn't be decided in that court, but it's the only legal mechanism that we have at this particular moment in time. And so if we go back even to the early 1900s, when indigenous people in the United States were at their lowest point, there's like 300,000 surviving indigenous people of the over a century of genocidal war, famine, disease, etc. Indigenous people at that time were also petitioning. After World War I, we had served in great numbers. We weren't technically U.S. citizens, but many had seen their service in that war as a commitment to uphold treaty rights. And so, for example, going back to my own nation, we served a lot of people, a lot of the sons and daughters. Let me back up. A lot of the sons of these original treaty signers were sent off to Carlisle Indian School, which closed its doors 100 years ago this year in 1918. They sent their sons to the Carlisle Indian School, and those graduates from that school were the ones that served in the military, and they served under the auspices that the United States would uphold its original agreements with us. For example, for us, it was getting back the Black Hills, or at least revisiting the Black Hills case. So after the war in 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, we had petitioned the United States government, Woodrow Wilson specifically, to have representation there because we saw ourselves as part of the world's colonized people. The Southeast Indian people who were colonized under the British at that time had sent wanted delegation because they fought in World War I as well. Many African nations also sought representation at the League of Nations at that time. So this is an ongoing issue. It's not just confined to domestic courts, because at that time we weren't even citizens. So how do you take a treaty case to court when you're not even a citizen of the United States? So this isn't just a new struggle. This is an ongoing struggle. And again, every time the United States government tramples on treaty rights, they're also trampling on their Constitution because they're not upholding their original agreement, Article 6.
And there is a lot of talk about the U.S. Supreme Court with a new justice about to be confirmed, maybe. What are your thoughts on why it's so important to pick justices that have knowledge of Indian country? It's
important for a variety of reasons, but I would like to back up, as a historian, I'd like to back up a little bit and try to contextualize why the Supreme Court has such power and to determine the fate of indigenous peoples, because they're the ones that are interpreting treaties. It goes back to Chief Justice John Marshall, who was appointed under John Adams, I think, in 1801. He expanded the scope of the Supreme Court beyond its original constitutional framework, right? not just for determining federal Indian law, but for other cases as well. And so Chief Justice John Marshall, he's famous for what we understand as the Marshall Trilogy. So he used the Supreme Court to interpret treaties, but also he used the Supreme Court to interpret the status of indigenous people indigenous nations specifically in the United States. And he was most famous in deciding the Cherokee cases. So under removal policy, when Andrew Jackson was trying to remove the Cherokee Nation and the so-called 5 civilized tribes from the South and begin westward expansion across the Mississippi River, Chief Justice John Marshall was playing a pivotal role in providing the legal mechanisms for the United States to do so. That included interpreting treaties, not as agreements between two sovereigns, but agreements between a superior sovereign, the United States, and what he called domestic dependent nations, the indigenous peoples, the original peoples of this land. And he based that argument on a racist doctrine known as the doctrine of discovery, but also that indigenous people were not civilized people and therefore not human. They were subhuman. So that has been codified in federal Indian law. So every Supreme Court case upholds that decision. So it's important that we do have sympathetic judges, but at the end of the day, what is most important is that we are operating under a very flawed system that's upholding an outdated, outmoded, racist legal doctrine that was created under the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is now beginning to renounce it. And so I think it's incumbent upon people of the United States, we didn't just, these are your treaties too, and your government signed these treaties with us. And so it's also your obligation to uphold them. And so maybe that looks like an amendment to the Constitution. Maybe that looks like a constitutional, bill that says that we are going to re-enter sort of formal international relations with the indigenous peoples, the first peoples of this land.
Well, thank you for your perspective today on treaties, and definitely a lot of history, and especially when we're looking at current issues going on in Indian country. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Antonia.